Dr. Friedoff, when Congress updated the Toxic Substances Control Act in 2016, one new provision requires EPA to account for potentially exposed and susceptible subpopulations in its assessment of whether the use of a chemical substance presents an unreasonable risk to health or the environment. How will your office use this provision to protect environmental justice communities close to facilities that release toxic chemicals into the environment?
Thanks very much for that question, Congresswoman. You know, the previous administration decided to exclude air, water, and disposal exposures from even being considered under the risk evaluations. And what that essentially meant is that they said that for purposes of TSCA, it doesn't count if you drink it, and it doesn't count if you breathe it. And we don't think that was the right approach. And we do plan, and we have reversed that policy decision. One thing that we're doing in order to better understand whether those risk evaluations that were finished by the previous administration exclude exposures like the ones you're talking about is develop a fence line screening methodology. And that methodology is intended to do a quick look at fence line communities who might be disproportionately exposed to these chemicals to be sure that the risk management actions that we're thinking about actually address the risk that these communities pose. And I expect that we'll be releasing that methodology for both peer review and public comment later this year.
Right, thank you. The PFAS roadmap that EPA recently released includes a commitment to re-examine previous decisions to allow new PFAS into commerce. In July, the New York Times reported that in 2011, the EPA approved 3 chemicals for fracking. Despite concerns by agency scientists, the chemicals had the potential to break down to PFAS, which threatens workers, human health, and our environment. Will the EPA revisit the chemicals it's approved for fracking as part of its review of previous decisions on PFAS approvals?
Thanks very much for that question. And we actually have been taking a backwards look at all of our previous PFAS decisions because there were a number that were approved in the 1980s before the agency really understands what it currently does about those chemicals. And we think all of them need to be looked at again. We're in the process of doing that, and I imagine that we'll have some results to share in the coming months.
Well, thank you for that, because 10 years ago, the agency scientists identified serious health risks to these chemicals, and yet they approved them anyhow. I believe we must do better, and now is an opportunity to correct that mistake. Next, for many years, we have recognized the need to address cumulative impacts of pollution on communities exposed to unsafe levels of air and water pollution from multiple sources. It's also critical EPA consider cumulative impacts when assessing cumulative chemical exposures, where a community could be impacted by more than one chemical or a mixture of chemicals. This can worsen the effects of exposure to the chemical being evaluated. Will your office use the Toxic Substances Control Act to advance the cumulative risk assessment of chemicals?
Thanks very much for that. It's actually a very, very difficult problem scientifically, and the entire agency is working together on ways that we can better understand the cumulative effects and ultimately on ways that we might be able to include cumulative effect considerations in our risk management rules. I think the fence line community methodology that I was describing to you earlier is just a first step of what we're looking at to try to understand and address the disproportionate exposures to pollution that some communities have faced, in some cases for decades. And I look forward to keeping the committee informed of these efforts as we move forward.
Well, thank you, Doctor, for your testimony. And I just want to continue to encourage you to look at these cumulative impacts. And I know it can be challenging, but when we're looking in a vacuum at approvals for one chemical in a vacuum, it doesn't really tell you in whole what it's doing to communities. And I do think that's important in the long term. So thank you for your service and your testimony today.